Morning. I want to invite you to turn with me this morning to the book of Revelation, and we are going to be in chapter 6 as we continue our study through the book of Revelation and examining the imagery and some of the more bizarre descriptions and things that we find in the book of Revelation, and walking through those and what those may apply to and how we can really seek to understand the core message of the book as we try to decipher a lot of the strange imagery we see. And as we've gone through chapters 4 and 5 so far, a lot of that has been either self-explanatory or it's something that the understanding of how to interpret the scene is fairly straightforward. There's not a whole lot of disagreement in those chapters by and large. But as we begin this morning in chapter 6, we get to the opening of the 7 seals, in particular the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as we like to call them. We're going to start to see the road that we travel on. If you imagine the interpretation of Revelation being like a path that you are walking in the woods, and it starts off where everyone begins at the same place and it's all more or less the same, and everyone kind of walks together. But when you get to chapter 6 to the 4 horsemen and begin to unpack chapter 7 and so on from there, it's as if you arrive at not just a fork in the road as though you can go left or right, but arriving at a fork which branches off into thousands of other directions, and people spreading out and going in those thousands of different directions and debating with one another about all the minor details. And so it gets really confusing to discuss Revelation with people at this point, because every minor detail has a different interpretation for so many people as they try to pinpoint the specific time or the place or the person or the country or the nation that might be referred to by the images. And in doing that, we tend to muddy the waters and we miss the basic message. And so it's my intention as we begin to look at this book and we continue through chapter 6 that we focus on the core message and not get sidetracked in trying to identify what the minor details might apply to, but rather looking at the big picture. And I think ultimately you'll find that John oftentimes in his images is not intending to define a specific time or person or place, but rather that this is about big picture issues and addressing things that may not necessarily be as specific and detailed as we think they are. But we are going to focus our attention on verses 1 through 8 of chapter 6 this morning. And so we are going to cover the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And we're going to address their origins, what other biblical connections there are, and try to understand what these horsemen represent. What is it that John is describing for us? And so I invite you to turn with me to chapter 6 of Revelation if you have not yet, and to join with me in reading as we begin in verse 1. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. And its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. As we look here, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are the first 4 seals. So as we're looking at the scroll being opened, as Jesus, the Lamb, is opening the scroll and breaking the seals to do so, there are 7 of these seals that keep it closed. And here with the 4 horsemen that ride out, these are the first 4 seals. So the white horse is 1 seal, the black horse is another seal, the red horse is another seal, and the pale horse is a 4th seal. And so as you look at these 4, that's 4 out of the 7 gone, and that's where our attention will be at this point this morning. Now, the four horsemen of the apocalypse is kind of captivated pop culture. You'll find references in lots of different areas that are not biblical, and you'll see references to the four horsemen showing up in popular music and movies and TV shows, all sorts of references like that are not biblical at all and have no desire to connect to anything biblical. It's just a bizarre and kind of well-known image that is very striking. And because it's striking and effective, because it grabs your attention, and it communicates the ideas so well, it is popular for people to reference in terms of these different kinds of cultural references. But I want us to really dive in and understand the purpose that these horsemen have and the image and the vision that John sees and what they do to contribute to the message of the book of Revelation. Now, if you were to read this, you would imagine there's absolutely nothing else like this in Scripture. You would look at this passage, you say, this is so unique, there's nothing else like it in Scripture. But that's actually not the case. The roots for this vision actually come from the Old Testament. Now, John's description is going to be different in many of the details, and in fact be much more detailed than what we might get in the Old Testament passage we're going to look at. However, you'll notice some of the similarities between what John writes in Revelation and between the Old Testament passage we're going to see. Now, in the past couple of weeks, we've looked at the book of Ezekiel and demonstrated how there are some similarities or patterns in what John is writing that connect to or follow similar lines to what we see Ezekiel prophesying in his day and age. And so now we're going to look at that again, except this time it's going to be our focus turning to the book of Zechariah, not Ezekiel. So let me direct your attention to Zechariah. And as we find our way to the book of Zechariah, we are again going to look at chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 8. And it's actually, again, just think about that. It's kind of interesting how that works out. We have Revelation 6, 1 through 8. We have Zechariah 6, 1 through 8. They're both going to be connecting to one another in terms of the imagery that is being addressed. So in Zechariah 6, verses 1 through 8, Zechariah sees this vision, and he describes it. And I want you to pay attention to some of the patterns or the similarities in the description. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains. And the mountains were mountains of bronze, and the first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. And then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, these are going out to the 4 winds of heaven. After presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth, the chariot with the black horses goes towards the north country, the white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, go patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth, and then he cried to me, behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country. So you should notice initially that there are some similarities here. Obviously, they're not exactly the same, but the roots for the vision that John gives us in Revelation come from Zechariah. So I want to point out some of the similarities in Zechariah because while the visions are not identical, and we can see that John carries more specific details in his vision that he shares. And obviously, John's description is pertaining to something a little bit different than what Zechariah's vision is pertaining to. There's a large time gap between these. And Zechariah was addressing something that was a little bit more immediate to his time than what we see that John appears to be doing. And so there are some differences in these passages, but there are some common points that would help us to understand the overall meaning and to pick out some of the details of why John shares some of the details that he does. What does the image mean? And what's the significance of some of the details he gives us? So I want to point out some of the symbolism here that is being discussed in both passages. The first one is the symbolism of chariots and horses. Now, as we look at both Zechariah and Revelation, we see that there are horses involved. Now, in Zechariah, the horses are pulling a chariot. Now, in ancient times when they would use chariots, you often would not necessarily have one horse pulling a chariot because of the weight and the amount of strength it would take to do that. They would often have perhaps like 2 horses. And so these 2 horses would pull these chariots. And of course, depending on the size of the chariot and how much weight there was in it and how many people were going to be in the chariot, that would determine how many horses were going to be pulling it. But if you look at chariots, they were oftentimes used in warfare, in particular in the ancient world. They were very common on the battlefield. And nations like Egypt or the Hittites would use them and were very proficient at them. And chariots were a very important part of ancient warfare because they were, for their time period, the equivalent of something like a tank. You see, you would have infantry, and with infantry you would be able to engage in certain kinds of warfare, but if you had chariots, that would give you a leg up in a lot of different areas. So the advantage that chariots would give on the battlefield is that they would obviously have speed on their side because they're being pulled by horses. And so the horses would be able to carry the soldiers that were in that chariot, carry them around the battlefield much faster than any infantry could march or even try to run. And so you could outflank your opponents, and you could get an army around their side and you could flank them. Now, oftentimes with chariots, they would have a driver, and then they would have at least one, if not multiples, again, depending on the size of the chariot, having multiple archers who would be in the chariot as well. And so the chariot could drive around the flanks of the army that it was facing, and the archers could launch arrows into the sides of the ranks at places where they were weak, and they could rout an army in that way. This is why Egypt was so powerful in its day and age, because they had chariots, and they used them effectively, and it gave them a leg up on their opponents. In the same way, the Hittites dominated their region for a long time because they were proficient with chariots. And so chariots were kind of like having a tank on the battlefield. You had the natural armor of the chariot that was protecting the bodies, or at least the lower bodies of those who were in the chariot. You had the speed so that they were not going to be caught or really be able to be face down with the infantry. So you had the benefit kind of a cavalry, but then also of being able to have multiple people in it, not just one, so that you can loose multiple arrows in different directions, depending on where you are. And so chariots gave armies a significant advantage, and for that reason, they were viewed as the premier weapon that was able to be employed on the battlefield. And so they were viewed as being a symbol of war. They were viewed as being a symbol of speed and power because they contributed those aspects to an army and allowed them to be victorious more often than not. Now, in the future days, as warfare developed, we get to the time of Rome when John would be writing in the book of Revelation, around that time period where he would be ministering and writing this book. Chariots had kind of fallen by the wayside. There were still some armies in the world that used them, but the predominant army, Rome, didn't really use chariots for that reason. They used chariots as parade items. Basically, that the emperor or noble people, when they were going in parades down the streets, would be in very ornamental chariots that would obviously look impressive, but they didn't really use chariots in warfare. They would just use infantry, artillery, in the sense of having different kinds of siege type weapons. They would have archers, and they would have cavalry. And so they would use horses on the battlefield, but not in the context of pulling chariots. So this was something that Rome didn't really use and was not as predominant on the battlefield in John's day as we see in the day of Zechariah. So what does this tell us? Well, clearly the common denominator is horses. You have horses pulling chariots, and in the days that John is writing, you have horses that were gave the leg up to a military, because the speed and the versatility of cavalry and the power that was brought along with that allowed them to get a leg up on the opposing army, because you could use a cavalry unit to flank an opposing army and to wipe out their infantry or to intimidate them in that way. And so in both cases, while we see that Zechariah mentions chariots and John mentions horses, there's a connection in the basic theme. Because according to the days of Zechariah, the premier battlefield equipment, or the unit that gave an army the upper hand the most, was the chariot in war. With it came speed and power. In the same way with John, in the days of Rome, one of the units that gave them so much power and was understood to be so important was the horse, the cavalry unit, because of the speed and the power that it gave to the soldiers who would use them. And so the symbolism of chariots and horses here is being connected to the idea of war, showing that there is speed, that there is power behind it, and it is connected to the idea of military advantage and military usage. So that is a point in common between Zechariah and John in their visions. Another point of commonality we see is the number 4. Again, there are 4 different chariots that are being pulled by these horses that Zechariah sees. And when we get to John's book in Revelation, he sees 4 different horsemen who are riding out. So the number 4 is another point of commonality between the two. Now, the symbolism of the number 4 is pretty important, and it is shared in both of these. And we can understand the symbolism a little better when we read Zechariah. Why is there 4? Why not 3 or 5 or 7? Or what specifically is important about number 4? Well, I mentioned that number 7, as we've gone through the book of Revelation, that number 7 has some importance in being connected to divinity, that 7 is associated with God, and it is associated with the idea of bringing something to completion. Well, number 4 also carries that kind of mentality, meaning the idea of completion or totality. That when you have 4, it's showing that something is complete, that it is being done to the fullest. So to give you an example of this, let's look at Zechariah and see what it says, that these 4 chariots that ride out, as Zechariah asks the messenger, the angel of the Lord, he says, who are these, or what are they doing? And what does he say? The angel responds and says, these are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. So they're going out to the 4 winds of heaven. Now the 4 winds of heaven is a phrase that's used by the ancient Hebrews, and it's a way of basically talking about direction and talking about the totality of the earth. So for us, we don't say something like the 4 winds of heaven, but we will talk about 4 major directions: north, south, east, and west. Right? So we think about there being a north, south, east, and west, and that kind of divides the world up into quadrants. To say, if I go this way, I'm heading north. If I go this way, I'm heading south, east, and west. And so we kind of divide everything up into 4 directions. And if you take all of them together, it covers everything. In the same way here, the 4 winds of heaven being kind of linked to different directions and covering the entire earth. And so we see these 4 chariots, they cover and kind of patrol the entire earth, and also that they are going with the 4 winds of heaven. So there's an idea of this complete and total coverage that is being discussed. So when we get to John and we see that there are 4 horsemen, there are 4 horses that are riding out, this is communicating the same idea, that there is a complete and total coverage of the earth that is being discussed here. And he is going to mention that and talk about it as well, that they are given power and authority over the earth. So there's the idea of coverage, a complete and total coverage that is being connected here to the usage of the number 4. Now, another shared detail that we need to reference, and something that we're going to really dig into more at the end, is the marching orders for these chariots and for these horsemen. In both passages, we learn the origin of the chariots and the origin of the horsemen. Where do they come from? They aren't just randomly patrolling on their own merits. They're not acting on their own accord. They're acting with marching orders, meaning they are being instructed to do a certain thing, and they are acting in accordance with the instruction or the authority that they have been given. So in Zechariah, we see that they all ride out from between these 2 mountains of brass, as they're described, or mountains of bronze. And it tells us that the angel of the Lord, as he speaks to Zechariah, he says, these are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. In other words, they have already presented themselves to the Lord of the earth. They have gone before God, and they are now riding out following them. Meaning they have been given marching orders. They are coming from God, and they are going out into all the earth. So their marching orders, their directive is coming from the Lord. Their authority that is over them is God in heaven. And so they may be representing or discussing nations and empires and armies that are marching around the world, things like that. But they are doing so under the authority that God has given, and He has given them their marching orders and sent them out to accomplish these different things. So we see then that the chariots are sent out after first having gone before the Lord and having received their marching orders, so to speak. Now when we get to John and Revelation, we see that these 4 horses, as they ride out, they are being called forth by the living creatures. So each of the 4 living creatures says, come, and in response we see a horse riding out and going out into the earth. So these are being given marching orders from the Lord. And in result of this as well, we see it as the Lamb, and as Jesus who is opening up the seals, unleashing these things to happen. So all of these events that John describes in Revelation, these 4 that he describes as the horsemen riding out, this is all happening under the authority, under the umbrella of the Lord's command. And they are being sent out to accomplish something according to God's will. And so their marching orders are coming from the command of God. But now, having looked at this and seen some of the points of commonality, of course we see the colors of the horses, they're also similar. But we're going to really dive into that in John. We're going to look at the colors and the descriptions of these horses and the riders that are on them, and we're going to unpack what they intend to mean. What does the horse represent, and what does the rider on it represent? What is being discussed here? Who is it talking about, or what events is it talking about? So we're going to begin here in the beginning here of chapter 6, looking at the white horse. And so we see that one of the living creatures calls forward one of these horses. And we are to see the description here in verse 2 that it is a white horse. And the rider that is sitting on this horse is described as having a bow, of having a crown that was given to him, and that the fact that it is going out to conquer, and that it is conquering, or that it has conquered. So let's look at the imagery here and just unpack this. So the first horse is white. Now, what would a white horse communicate, generally speaking? What is the significance of the horse being white, and why does that distinguish it from the others? Well, white horses have a tradition and across mythology, across the world. We tend to associate white horses with the same kinds of ideas. No matter what your background is, white horses are kind of viewed in a similar way to some degree. They're usually associated with majesty, royalty, conquest, or something very regal about them. Now, in the days that John would be writing this in the Roman Empire, the white horse had a particular significance. And it's important for us to understand what the white horse would mean in John's time to the audience that he is addressing, if we really want to understand the message that this would communicate to the original audience. What did the white horse signify? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that the Romans didn't really use chariots except for in parades and things of that nature. They didn't really employ them on the battlefield, but they would use them to demonstrate the might and power of Rome, and to have parades and to celebrate the greatness of Rome, and to draw attention to the emperor or to people like that. So they would also use white horses in these things called triumph parades. They would have these triumphs where the emperor or a conquering general or people of nobility, things like that, in order to display their power, they would ride a white horse, or they would have a chariot or something being pulled by white horses to pull attention to the idea that they are nobility and that they have been victorious. And so for them, the white horse was used in their victory parades following battles in order to display their power and to show their strength to the places that they had now conquered and brought into their empire. And so white horses had a specific usage in the symbolism of showing victory and triumph, and it was associated with the Roman parades that would be put on. Now, this was also something that would tend to happen as well, that a king in the ancient world, if he was riding into a place and he was doing so as a conquering king, he would ride into a city on a horse, particularly and if it was available, a white horse. And so this was a symbol that was used in a lot of different ways to show a king riding in, and that he would display his power and his victory over the people that were conquered by riding through the streets on a white horse. So that should tell us perhaps then that the white horse is communicating that idea, especially when we see the way that this horseman is described and the way that it is all put together. So there are three elements that we see about this horseman who is riding. One is that he has a bow. The other is that he has a crown that was given to him, and the other that he goes out to conquer or to be a conqueror. And so he is carrying out conquest in the process of his commission. So the first element is that he has a bow. Now, obviously a bow is a weapon of war, and so that's pretty significant. But more specifically, a bow is used as a weapon that gives you a long-range advantage. Right? You can have swords, axes, all sorts of different, spears, shields, things like that would be used in war, but the bow would give you a long-range advantage. And so what would the bow communicate in particular? Not just that there is warfare going on, but also that there is a far-reaching impact, that the rider on this horse has a far range of impact, that he is far-reaching in his influence, and that he is able to reach enemies from a long distance away, or to go out into an area of expansion. And so the bow would indicate then a far-reaching or a widespread impact that this rider has. Now, the crown being given, again, is a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of victory. Crowns being used to demonstrate someone who has kingship, who has power and authority in a land, but also being given out to those who are victorious. And emperors would wear crowns and things to demonstrate their victory, again, using it in those kinds of parades and displays of power. Now, it's not specified who gives the crown here. We may suggest that perhaps it's being given by God as some sort of divine ordination, but we don't really have a specific person being described. It's just demonstrating that a crown was given to him. It doesn't say by who, and there's no real specific understanding. But the crown is a symbol of authority and of victory. And then we learn that this rider goes out conquering and to conquer, meaning he goes out with the intention to conquer, and he may as well have accomplished that. He has conquered. So he is going out as one who has conquered, and is going out with the effort and the intention to continue conquering. Now, in this case, we see this is the idea of conquest, of going out like an empire would, or like a kingdom that was powerful, a king riding out to conquer. to establish a wide-reaching empire, a widespread area, something like the Roman Empire would represent. Now, this is where we get a lot of dissension, however, the white horse and how we understand the horseman who is riding. Because the interpretation here is up for debate. There are a lot of questions as to what this is meant to describe. And this is a significant thing to point out because the way you interpret the white rider or the white horseman is going to direct your attention in a different area, and it's going to take you down a different path depending on what you read this as. Now, because Jesus is later described at the end of Revelation in chapter 19 as riding out victoriously on a white horse, and he has a crown, and there's some similarities and things like that. Because Jesus is described as riding on a white horse, there are many who read this and say, well, this must be Jesus. That he is going out and he is riding out to victory. He's riding out ahead of all these other things, and everything that comes after him is the judgment that's coming as he carries out his victorious conquest, so to speak, or establishes his kingdom in the world. Now, obviously, the reason why that connection is made is because of the white horse in both instances. But it really doesn't seem to fit in this instance because Jesus is already in this vision that John describes as the lamb who's opening the seals. It seems a bit odd that Jesus would be the lamb opening the seals while also then being described as the king or the rider who is going out as well. If he's opening the scrolls, it just doesn't necessarily seem to fit that he would have two different identities in the same vision. That's just not usually how these kinds of things work. So it doesn't really seem to fit. We also see that the description of Jesus in chapter 19 is far more extensive, far more detailed, and is not exactly the same as this. There are similarities, but it's not the same. And we can also understand that as well that the rider on the white horse, as we look at the other horses here, it raises some questions. You know, when you say that Jesus is riding out to establish his kingdom, and he does so, the spread of the gospel or the spread of the kingdom of Christ is established by warfare, bloodshed, famine, and pestilence. That's not really how I would think of the gospel spreading and Christ establishing his kingdom in the world. That doesn't really seem to make sense. So I don't think that there's obviously a reason to draw the two together, but it doesn't seem that the image is intended to convey Jesus in this case. The context just doesn't really seem to fit. Others, however, have then just suggested that the rider on the white horse may be reflective of a specific kingdom or an emperor in the days of Rome or a specific power or entity, some ruler, and trying to identify which Roman ruler was known to carry a bow or had that in his imagery or iconography or things of that nature, and trying to suggest that there's a specific historical figure that this white rider connects to that would fit in the timeline of history. But ultimately, you can take that a million different directions, and people have, as they attempt to connect this rider to many different kinds of people, and you could try to cram it and make it fit a number of different historical figures. But John's vision isn't really that specific, and I don't think it's meant to be that specific. I think it's fairly vague, and it's fairly vague for a reason, because he's talking about an idea here, not a specific person. The rider isn't necessarily meant to be a specific historical figure, but rather the idea of conquest. That the rider who is riding out on the white horses is riding out in the spirit of conquest. It's demonstrating the attitude that large kingdoms and empires have, that they appoint themselves, so to speak, or they would believe they're doing so. And they go out with the spirit of, manifest destiny, or we're going to conquer. We're going out to conquer our enemies, and we are going in the spirit of ones who have already done so. And the Roman Empire would be a primary example of this, saying, we are going out to conquer and we will be victorious. And they carry that out, and lo and behold, with that fervor and that attitude and their military might, they conquer the world, or at least the known world at the time. So in John's day, Rome controlled a vast expanse, a very far-reaching empire, a large territory, and they had an effect on the lives of most of the world's entire population. And this would all seem to align here: the white horse, the bow, the spirit of conquest, the crown, the victory and the authority. All of these things would seem to align with the Roman Empire and to align with empires in general that have this sort of spirit and this attitude that is carried out. And then that would lead us into these other horses that would tend to follow this spirit of conquest or the establishment of these empires and these human kingdoms. So we get to the red horse as the second horse here, looking at the next verse. And it says that as this one comes forward in verse 4, it is bright red. And its rider is permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. The red horse, the color is significant and makes sense with what the rider does. The color red is associated with blood, right? We understand blood as being a color red and being a bright red in some cases, and so we look at the red horse and it has the connection to the idea of blood. And this is particularly relevant to the action that the rider on this horse takes. In this case, the rider that is going out carries a sword and takes peace from the earth. In other words, engages in war. So the rider on the red horse has a sword and engages in warfare across the world. Now, the sword, as we look at this, would be a symbol of warfare. It would be kind of like a gun today. It's the symbolism of warfare, the most common weapon that would be used by soldiers who are engaging in acts of warfare. Obviously, in military conquest of that day, there were a lot of different weapons. You would have bows, you would have swords, you'd have axes, you'd have maces, you'd have spears, all kinds of different weapons that would be used. But the sword was the most common. It was the sidearm. It was the weapon that pretty much every soldier carried, either as their primary weapon or as a backup. And so this was the kind of weapon that everyone would associate. People that would travel and would be protecting themselves would have a sword as their sidearm, something like that. And so the sword was the primary symbol of warfare. And it is fitting because we see that that is exactly what this rider is going to do. He's going to ride out and he is going to take peace from the earth. He is going to bring war. And of course, along with war, we see that there will be a lot of bloodshed, as wars tend to do. And so as warfare is engaged, the sword is being carried, and that people are slaying one another in acts of war. Again, this is not necessarily be understood as some specific individual, but rather talking about the idea of war and the effect that war brings on the world to those who engage in it. It brings bloodshed, death, and all manner of things such as that. And so here we have the red horse following the rider who is going out in a spirit of conquest. Now we have war being brought across the face of the earth as well. Now, following the rider who is going out, the warfare that is taking place, we see a black horse. And the black horse is the third one mentioned, and we see here the description. As John looks, he sees this black horse, and he says, its rider had a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures, saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. Now again, the black horse is associated, black being associated with something kind of sinister or dark, associated with the idea of darkness or famine, things like that. And so this is what the color black would tend to be linked to in these kinds of ideas. Now, we see that the black horse, again, we have the sinister kind of dark connection to that, and you would understand that something negative is following with it, the black horse being an imposing figure in that case. But we see the rider is carrying some interesting things, not weapons of war, but in this case, economic utensils, if we would call them that. And so we see there are 3 references in relation to this rider on the black horse. The first one is the scales that are in his hands. And then we see a mention of wheat and barley, and we see a mention of oil and wine. So what are these all talking about? Well, again, scales, in our day and age, we tend to look at scales as being a symbol of justice. The idea that justice is being carried out, the scales would show balance, right? That there's a fair and balanced carrying out of justice. And to show that things are equally measured and that things are just and fair. But in the ancient world, before we associated scales with the idea of, or the concept of justice, they were more literally applied to the concept of economics. Right? That people would barter, and a lot of times in the ancient world what you find is that the value of money is dependent upon the weight that money had. So thinking about the value of gold pieces today is something, you weigh it, you determine how much gold is there, and that tells you the value. Now for us, we have pennies and nickels and dollar bills and things, and the value of that coin or that cash is not based on how much it weighs. It doesn't mean that the heavier the item is, the more valuable it is. It's just based on what that monetary unit represents and what's inscribed on it. And so that's the value of money today. But in the day that we're looking at, when trade would happen, the value of money and coins was related to the weight of that coin. So when trade was going on to determine the fair value for something, they would often weigh things. So you would take the items being traded, money or whatever it might be, and they would place them on these scales, and you would try to get them to be balanced in this case. And the idea then is that if things were of equal weight, then they would be of equal value, generally speaking. And so the idea then here, as the scales are being carried, is that this is implying the idea that there's going to be some economic effect that is taking place. The scales demonstrate that there is an economic impact that is going to be happening as a result of these riders that are going out into the world. Now, we see a mention, a voice that comes from among the 4 living creatures describing the value of wheat and the value of barley, the price that will be set on that. Now, without diving too much into the value here of what's going on, just suffice it to say that what is being suggested is that the price for wheat and barley is very expensive. It would be something like a day's wages, equivalent to a day's wages for an amount of wheat. So in other words, it would be like taking a paycheck that you would earn in one day and having to contribute towards that, or basically take what you earned in a day to buy your food. And so you can imagine that's an exorbitant rate. That's a high rate that means you can't spend your money on anything else. It means that your daily wages are going to buy food, and that's how much it's going to cost just to get the wheat. And then we see the barley is not as valuable as wheat, so there's 3 times the barley you get. But either way, these are items that are being vastly overpriced, which communicates then the idea of maybe either high taxes or low value of money. It's talking about the fact that the economic system is out of balance, that there is a high rate of taxation, or that there is a scarcity of the item, meaning that it's much more valuable than it should be because there's just not much there. Again, if we understand the idea of famine happening, well, that would cause the price of wheat and barley to skyrocket because those are staples that would be used to feed people. And so staple food items would skyrocket in value because if there's less of them, then the value, the demand is going to be high. So with the wheat and barley, we see these are staple necessity food items that are costing an arm and a leg, essentially, demonstrating a financial catastrophe. Now we also see this interesting reference that says, do not harm the oil and wine. Now, oil and wine were items of luxury. These were things that would be owned by people who were wealthy. If you owned an olive vineyard or you owned a grape vineyard, these were things that rich people had. They were luxury items, and if you owned them, you were well off. And so it's saying don't harm the luxurious items or the commodities, the things that have especially high value, that would signify wealth. What's being said here? Is it saying don't change the price of these, or what's happening? Well, interestingly enough, if you look into history, you'll notice that in the history of the Roman Empire, at times where the taxation rate would get really high, when they began to lobby very heavy taxation on the citizens of Rome, it would be a practice among the wealthy to pretend as though they were not as wealthy as they were to keep their taxation rate low. This is something that still happens today in different ways as well. To avoid taxation, you try to hide some of your wealth in order to make sure that you're not getting fully taxed like you would be based on the regulations that are put forward. So what would happen is that wealthy landowners who would have olive vineyards or they would have wine vineyards, in order to avoid those high rates of taxation, they would go out and they would burn down their vineyards. They would destroy their vineyards so that they didn't have those things to their name. So when the tax collectors would come by and assess their property values and demand the taxes, they would try to say, look, I see all of my vineyards, I don't have anything. It's all been destroyed. There's nothing there, so you can't tax me on it. But what happened is that the Roman Empire and leaders at the times like this, they understood what was happening. And so they would threaten the wealthy landowners. They would say, if you harm your own crop, if you go out and destroy your own vineyards in order to avoid taxes, you are going to be punished by the full extent of the law, even up to death. They would threaten death on those who would harm their own vineyards in order to make them pay full price for the taxation that was being levied. And so that seems to be what's going on here, is that what is being suggested is that there will be a high rate of taxation or a famine causing the staple food items to skyrocket in price, meaning that people are going to be starving and struggling, and anyone who tries to avoid that by feigning poverty is going to be subject to the punishment of the law, and that they potentially will be forfeiting their life if they try to pull that off. And so it's a warning against trying to avoid the economic outpouring that is going on in this case. The idea, again, being that there's economic catastrophe that is following this famine and that is following this warfare and the bloodshed and the things that are going on. And then that leads us to the fourth horse, the pale horse. Of course, the most grisly and disturbing one of all that we see described in a very unique way. Now, the specific color here, when it says pale, is something like a sickly yellow-green. It would be a color that you would associate with plague or with death, meaning like the kind of color that a body turns after it has been decayed. Right? We're talking about a very gnarly, grisly kind of description here of this sickly, ill person or someone who has died. And it's saying that the horse is that kind of color, which obviously is very unsettling. And we see the rider who is on this horse is named Death, and that Hades or hell follows behind him. What's being described here? Well, obviously we see the idea that if this pale horse being referenced with the connection that it has is showing that there's going to be widespread death, there's going to be plague and illness that is going to be happening following all of these things that are going on. So death, again, is personified here. And the fact that death is personified should help us understand that the first three horses and riders are not meant to be taken as historical figures either. If the fourth rider, death, is just a concept that is being personified, being described like a person, when we obviously know that death is not actually a physical entity, if that's the case, that should help inform us that the former writers also are talking about ideas or concepts. They're talking about the idea of conquest or empire. They're talking about the idea of warfare. They're talking about the idea of famine or economic catastrophe, and not specific individuals that are supposed to fill these shoes. And so here we see death as personified as the one that is riding on this horse, and that following it is a massive loss of life, that there are plagues that are happening, illness and things like this. And of course, plagues were an especially bad scourge on the world in that time. We are in the midst of a pandemic that, Lord willing, will end before too long, or will make its way out of being pandemic status. But even with the fear we see going on now, understanding how terrified we are of the death rate as it is, and how many drastic decisions are being made. Now imagine thousands of years ago, in these days where they didn't have all the medical and technological advances, and imagine how deadly a plague would be. Not knowing sanitation practices to the degree that we do, or knowing how to try to avoid some of these things. Imagine the fear that would inflict and how many lives would be taken. Rome was no stranger to plagues and to things like that. There was one, the Antonine Plague, that supposedly resulted in as many as 5,000 people dying a day in Rome for a period of time. Can you imagine that? The city of Rome potentially having 5,000 people die every single day for that period of time while that plague is happening. Clearly, we see that plague and death was something that would be terrifying, especially in the context of when this is being written. And we see that following death is Hades, that hell is following after, which would add to the terror of this rider. It would remind us the destination of those who are brought to judgment. Saying that as death is coming upon these people that are caught up in the judgment that's going on, that hell follows after, meaning that they are caught up, that they're being added to the number of the dead, and understanding hell being a place of judgment, and realizing that this is judgment that's being carried out on the earth, not including the church. This is judgment on people who are not within the church, and understanding their judgment being death and hell. And so this is a very powerful and somber reminder of the terror that comes with this fourth horseman, that brings with it death and Hades. And so we see here that death is also given a specific command. A command or the authority to act and to reap, as it were, a fourth of the earth. Again, the church not being included, but showing that through war, through famine, illness, wild beasts, that through these areas or these different aspects, that people's lives would be taken and that death would come across the earth, up to a fourth of the population. Now, we don't need to focus too much in on the idea of 1/4 here and trying to figure out, does this mean, specifically a quarter of the world's population will die, or what's being going on here? We don't necessarily need to dive into that and focus too much on the significance of 1/4 here, other than to note that generally it means there is a large impact. There are going to be a lot of people that are subject to this. And understanding that the intensity of God's judgment throughout the book of Revelation will get worse. So as the number starts out here a fourth, later on we'll see it goes up to a third, and so on and so forth. And so the intensity of the judgment that's carried out throughout Revelation gets more and more extensive. And here it starts at a baseline of 1/4, demonstrating clearly not a majority, but a significant portion that would be noticed. And that leads us into the fifth and final point here, and that is examining the biblical tradition of God's judgment. What is the biblical tradition about God's judgment and how he carries that out? Because Revelation actually fits the bill perfectly. Revelation carries on the tradition of how God's judgment is described in the Old and the New Testament. Let me give you an example of this. In Ezekiel, if we look at Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 21, Ezekiel writes this, "For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment, sword, famine, wild beast, and pestilence, to cut off from it man and beast." Do you notice anything similar there between that and Revelation? He says, when I send my 4 acts of judgment. So we see the number 4 again. And specifically mentioning those 4 acts of judgment are sword, famine, wild beast, and pestilence. What do we see being described we see the 4 horsemen, that are the 4 riders that are going out as a part of God's judgment being carried out. And we see there's a mention of the sword, right, that's being carried. We see the mention of famine. We see the mention of pestilence, and we see the mention of wild beasts here also. And so when it says that there is a fourth of the earth is subject to these acts, and the 4 that are mentioned specifically line up: sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beast. that lines up with Ezekiel. So we see that this is clearly an act of God's judgment. And this was how God's judgment was understood, that as he judged the land and the people that lived in it, they understood it as being expressed in these common ways. That this was a repetitive cycle, that there would be kingdoms that would rise up to engage in war, whether it was Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, the Hittites, Rome, whoever it might be, that empires would rise up from time to time. And as they would rise up, they would carry out war on the world around them, and they would conquer previous kingdoms. And this would be God's judgment on those kingdoms that was carried out. Then a new kingdom would rise up and would judge the former, and then the cycle would continue on from there. But as these kingdoms would ride out to conquest and to carry out warfare, they bring massive bloodshed. The result in carrying out war would be to destroy much of the local population, to introduce famine. And the famine existed because people were killed and crops and wheat and all these different things were burned and destroyed and trampled, or they were used to feed the army that was marching through, have scorched earth policies and things of that nature to salt the earth and things to prevent it from being productive, to subdue the people. And so you would have famine that would result from these armies marching through. And then because of famine and the low food quality and dirty, filthy water and things like this, then plague would rise up. And plagues would wipe out many more people. And then all of this would culminate in the encroachment of wild beasts. That as areas were depopulated, cities and towns were depopulated through death, that the wildlife would kind of encroach back over those places that were formerly populated with people, and now wild beasts would live there and would become a threat to the remaining inhabitants. And so God's judgment was understood in this cycle, and it was vividly demonstrated by John as he describes these four horsemen, and it's reflecting the pattern of judgment that's evident in the rise and the fall of many great empires and kingdoms, including Rome in the days of John. Rome was the premier example of this, but Rome was not the only example. As I mentioned, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, Egypt, these all fell prey to the same things and followed the same population effects and the sorts of things that would take place, and they were all judged by God in these manners. And then we see today that any empires and kingdoms that have existed since then have also gone through similar sorts of sway. But it's also consistent, the tradition of Revelation and how this is described, the judgment of God, it's consistent with how Jesus spoke of judgment as well. Look at me at Mark chapter 13. We're going to focus on verses 7 through 8. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus is talking about the end times, or the signs of the end times. And he says this in verses 7 and 8. He says, "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains." Jesus spoke in similar terms, talking about wars happening, nations and kingdoms fighting against one another, the resulting catastrophe and plagues and famine and things that would happen. And all of this was understood as signs of the end of days. Not that they themselves brought the end of days, but they were signs that things were coming nearer. That these were the beginning of birth pains, that this was a sign showing that the end was approaching, though it would not be just yet. And so in this way, we understand that God's judgment is not something that just happened in the past. It's not just something that's going to happen in the distant future. God's judgment isn't some event that we're looking to just to happen in the distant future or in the near future. But that God's judgment is ongoing, that there's a cycle that is happening where God carries out judgment on the earth and its inhabitants. But we also understand and can be encouraged in understanding this, that the judgment that is being carried out anticipates the return of Jesus. These seals being broken, the judgment of God being carried out, is anticipation of the return of Christ. And so while the world is in upheaval and in chaos, when these acts of judgment are carried out by the Lord, and they are done under His plan, when all of this happens and people are terrified by it, the church can be comforted and can be encouraged because we're reminded by the words of Jesus and by the message of Revelation that these acts of judgment are done in anticipation of the return of Jesus. That all of this is happening anticipating that when the judgment is carried out, Jesus will come again and He will establish His kingdom forever in eternity. And you and I as believers will be a part of that eternal kingdom that has been established for us. And so this is an incredible reminder for us to think of God's judgment, to understand that it is something that is carried out in these ways, that it is a cycle that tends to be repeated and has happened in the past, it happens today, and it will happen in the future. But all of God's judgment that is being carried out as it terrorizes and terrifies those who have rebelled against God, who reject him. For believers, we can take comfort in knowing that these are the signs of the times. Meaning that these are the birth pains. These are demonstrations. It's pain and it's the earth groaning at this time as we await the glorious return of Jesus Christ to make all things new and to restore his kingdom and to make everything right. And so we can celebrate that encouragement and that word that we see from the reminder we get in the book of Revelation and John's description of the four horsemen, the judgment that God carries out through these kingdoms and empires and these plagues and things that are affecting the world. And so as we think about these things, would you join me in prayer? Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the ability to study your word, to be able to reflect on the four riders, the horsemen that we look at, to think about their impact and what they stand for, Father, what John was describing for us. And we're reminded of your judgment and the ways in which your judgment is carried out in the world. But we're reminded as believers that we need not fear your judgment on the world because we have already had our sins forgiven. We stand in the blood of Jesus Christ as ones who have been forgiven and who have been restored to you. And so this judgment that's carried out does not cause us fear or terror, but rather it reminds us that Jesus is coming again. It reminds us a sign of the times, that though the end times are not quite yet, these things are happening in anticipation, and it is all setting the stage so that as your judgment is being carried out in the world, it is setting the stage for your Son, Jesus, to return again and to establish his kingdom forever. And we praise you and honor you for that. We pray everything in the name of Jesus. Amen.